I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. The words echoed with wonder, excitement, and disbelief. The thrill, the adventure, the overwhelming sense of awe. It was everything Charles Duke had dreamed of and more. Yet behind the triumph lay a secret he carried for nearly half a century. Duke, the lowest number of any man who'd set foot on the moon's surface, kept that secret buried under duty, silence, and pride of Apollo 16. Time fled, and he finally confessed what he had seen on that barren planet. Something that no training, no mission plan, and no science could ever have gotten him ready for. "That's just crazy," he would later whisper. This was no other moon landing. It was a revelation that upended everything humanity believed it had learned about its nearest space neighbor. Apollo 16 was called among NASA engineers the last great lunar Highlands bet. Planned in the early 1970s, it was intended to push the exploration boundaries. The United States had already demonstrated that it could send men to the moon and return them safely. This flight, though, had an ulterior motive, to unlock the secrets of the moon itself. Scientists in the hope that they would be able to provide answers to long-standing questions about the origin of the moon and its contribution to creating Earth by analyzing samples from the lunar highlands. Unlike the smooth plains of the previous Apollo missions, the Descartes highlands were rough and old, believed to be the exposed skeletons of the moon's crust. Some scientists thought the area was volcanic. Others, that it was composed of debris from ancient impacts. Apollo 16 would end that argument, but not without taking an enormous risk. The landing site selected was dangerous. Concealed slopes, rocky ridges, and giant boulders surrounded the site, with no margin for making a mistake. The lunar module had little reserve fuel to spare, and a single blunder could result in catastrophe. Engineers dreaded the vehicle might founder in dust or roll over on landing, but they moved ahead. With the Apollo program running out, there could never be another opportunity. The responsibility for that gamble rested with Charles Duke. Every choice counted. Every second was a countdown to oxygen, battery power, and fatigue. In charge of the mission was John Young, a legend at NASA. Calm, courageous, and unflappable under stress, Young had flown Gemini missions, circumnavigated the moon on Apollo 10, and even managed a legendary prank by smuggling a corned beef sandwich aboard. If there was anyone who could safely land on such hostile terrain, it was him. Duke, only 36, was a determined opposite number. Years previously, his error had caused NASA to take Ken Mattingly off Apollo 13 after Duke had exposed him to rubella. The conscience compelled Duke to redeem himself, and Apollo 16 was his chance. Mattingly, on the other hand, finally received his own second opportunity. As command module pilot, he would orbit the moon independently in Casper, while Young and Duke descended below. It was an isolating assignment, but one demanding flawless accuracy. The three made up a team characterized by toughness. All three had experienced failures that would have brought other astronauts' careers to an end, but all three came out stronger. Their constant training created an ideal blend: Young's discipline, Duke's motivation, and Mattingly's accuracy. They practiced for every conceivable threat: malfunctioning rovers, health crises, oxygen system breakdowns, and even the dreadful risk of having to transport a fallen crew member back to the lander. But no simulation could have readied them for what Duke afterwards recounted. NASA had prepared its astronauts to anticipate dust, rocks, and quiet, but not motion. The desolate moon was meant to be inert. But on one of their forays, Duke noticed something he couldn't account for moving across the lunar surface in close proximity to the rover. It was not in any instruction book, and it was not planned for any mission. Years later, his voice continued to shake as he remembered it. A momentary pause that contradicted reason and posed a question over one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. What else lurks in quietness of the moon? It was not something they'd been simulated for. It was a sort of unknown that no drill could prepare them for. On April 20th, 1972, after days navigating the desolation of space, Apollo 16's lunar module Orion landed on the highlands' rocky terrain of Descartes. Before them lay a battlefield of rock. Craters of sharp stone, great boulders that loomed above the horizon, and gray dust that clung like ash to anything it touched. When Charles Duke stepped out and felt the lunar ground beneath his boots, his voice trembled with disbelief. "I'm on the moon. I'm really on the moon." Every rock and every scoop of soil was a relic of cosmic history. Then came history's first drive across the moon. The rover bounced lightly in the weak gravity, sending dust into glittering arcs. They trudged miles into unknown terrain, scaling hills, jumping craters, and carrying back over 200 pounds of moon rock and dirt. Some of those samples subsequently showed that the moon had once been teeming with fire, charred by volcanoes born eons ago. Life on the moon, however, was tough. The suits were cumbersome, steps were clumsy, and even the simplest tasks sapped their energy. At night, crowded within the lunar module, they looked out over an unblemished horizon. To everyone else, Apollo 16 was a perfect success, a triumph of science. But for Duke, it was also the time that he bore a secret that he could never reveal. For in the quiet, when all had appeared normal, he glimpsed something that did not belong there, a flash, a shadow, a movement that was alive. For only one beat, it passed by the rover and into the sea of gray that stretched to infinity. Duke stood stock still. Was it a trick of the light, dirt on his visor, or had something actually moved across the desolate terrain of the moon? He remained silent with John Young and interred the idea, but deep within him, he knew that it had not been a hallucination. It was too sudden, too intentional. It was a presence. For half a century, Duke remained quiet. To history, Apollo 16 was another success. But to him, it was a flight on which he gazed into the abyss, and the abyss gazed back. When he came back to Earth, he brought not only moon rock and soil with him, but also a weight unseen by anyone else. An image seared into his mind, a brief shadow on the moon that could not be explained. He remained quiet because in 1972, NASA was struggling to sustain its budget. The Apollo program was coming to an end, and doubters were already suggesting the moon landings were a hoax. If Duke had appeared in front of the world and proclaimed, "I saw something out there," the consequences could have been disastrous. His own reputation, NASA's integrity, even America's victory in the space race might have collapsed. NASA's culture required discipline and logic. Astronauts were made to be logical, unbending, not dreamers who espoused shadows and impenetrable mysteries. To say such a thing could have caused someone ridicule, or worse, a career. So Duke remained silent. He assured himself it was exhaustion, a delusion, dirt on his visor. Silence is heavy, though, with each decade that went by, that moment nudged at his conscience harder. What if the cameras had captured it? What if the proof was still buried in reels of moon footage? What if silence from him meant humanity had lost an important part of the moon's history? 5 decades later, it was too much to bear. Duke, the youngest person set foot on the moon, ultimately decided to break his silence. He attempted for years to suppress the memory, to convince himself it was fatigue. But silence doesn't destroy memory. It makes it more acute. The vision of that shadow stayed with him like a dream that wouldn't go away. Years later, when Apollo footage had been converted to high definition, Duke couldn't help but consider the question. What if the cameras witnessed what I witnessed? He asked to see the archives. The images, hundreds of hours of the lunar rover and the module, took every bounce, every stumble, every horizon, and in it, the moment he had hidden for half a century. When the images rolled, it was no longer his memory anymore. There was motion, not still, not glare, but a dark shape moving over the lunar horizon at impossible velocity. Duke stood immobilized. It wasn't a blur. It had scale, bigger than the 10-foot rover next to it, and then just as abruptly it disappeared. No dust, no trail, only questions. In that moment, half a century of silence was broken. The thing he disbelieved and hidden away deep within himself was real. When Duke finally broke his silence, the world responded with shock and disbelief. Scientists scrambled to rationalize it away, an optical illusion, a malfunctioning camera, a trick of the light. But none could account for the size, the movement, or the intentional speed. Shadows do not run. Dust does not glide. Malfunctions do not measure themselves against physical objects. Some theorize debris, but Apollo's records documented no such incident. And then came rumors. Could the moon be hiding something more profound, powers beyond comprehension? For each skeptic with a hypothesis, there were those believers who perceived Duke's confession as the crack in the armor of certitude. To others, The moon had ever been a mirror of the mysterious, and Duke's words another reflection of the timeless unknown. What if Apollo 16 was not merely an expedition of discovery, but humanity's initial contact with something we were never supposed to discover? The experience altered Duke forever. Astronauts will come back changed, but in his case, the transformation was deeper. The desolation of the moon and seeing that inexplicable shadow shattered something within him. Science cannot define it. Logic cannot dig it up. Eventually, he came to turn to faith, talking of seeing God again and understanding that mankind wasn't grasping for rock and stars, but something greater, something eternal. But beneath his rhetoric was a secret. The shadow of a gigantic, impossible figure on the moon's surface. For years, he wore his charm and his discipline as armor, smiling for interviews, talking to students, always the astronaut, never the witness. But truth breaks against silence. In a guilty admission, Charles Duke finally broke silence. It was not one of us. It was not a trick of the light. I should have spoken long ago. The immediate response was instantaneous. Some labeled him delusional, while others blamed him for attention-seeking. But those who believed in the inexplicable perceived it as vindication. This was not a conspiracy nut. This was an Apollo astronaut, a man who had been there, driven on alien ground, and witnessed the impossible. For Duke, it was never about convincing the world. It was about releasing the weight he had carried for half a century. Apollo 16 will forever be remembered not just as a mission of triumph, but as the moment one man saw something humanity still cannot explain. And in that silence, the moon keeps its secrets, waiting for those who dare to return and perhaps finally understand what Charles Duke carried to his grave. Even in his later years, the ghost of that shadow tormented him, more real than the rocks he gathered or the excitement of setting foot on another planet, as if the moon itself had branded on him its secret, one that no human was ever meant to carry. In his own quiet hours, when he gazed at the starry night sky, he could still envision the gray horizon, the glint of,